Yeah, who knows? He he's a preacher's kid, and he was respected in the church, and but apparently there was a period there where he decided this isn't true, it isn't working, and Christians don't act like Christ, and so I don't believe this stuff. But then he was smart, and he was hardworking, and he skipped a grade in high school, and then it came time for his senior year, and he skipped that too, and he went straight to college. So he went into college when he was 15. And by that time, he had decided he needed to understand Jesus, what Jesus did, what Jesus said, because he had come to believe that Jesus really was the guide and the answer. And so he went to college, got a Bachelor of Science, then he went to a seminary in Philadelphia and got a Bachelor's in Theology. And then he had the option, and his dad was a moderately famous black minister. Called them Negroes back then. And he had good credentials and a good reputation. He could have gotten on staff or become a pastor of a well-off African-American church in the North and lived a safer life. But he really felt he had to go back to the South. And he got called to be the pastor of a church in Montgomery, Alabama. About that time, this is in his mid-20s, about that time his parents are really encouraging him and enabling him to get a PhD in philosophy from Boston University. There were some guys there that he just really wanted to learn from, is why he picked that school, about what human life is and who God is and how God relates to humans and where do good and evil come from. And these were the things he wrestled with, and he was serious. The guy was smart, and he read difficult stuff, and he had difficult arguments, and he really wanted to understand what goes on. And so while he's a pastor of Dexter Avenue, I believe it was, Baptist Church in Montgomery, he's finishing his PhD in philosophy in Boston. But it's also happens to be the same time that Rosa Parks decides, no, she's not going to get up out of that bus seat. And the churches, the Negro churches in town decided, we got to stand with this lady. We got to make an issue of this. So they start meeting together. Well, there's this young pastor. I mean, 25? That's young, right? Raise your hand if you think 25 is young. He gets elected by them. He apparently wasn't real enthusiastic about taking this position, but he got elected by them to head the committee, to be the main spokesman. And that was the Montgomery bus boycott. Went on for well over a year. It went all the way to the federal government. It was scary. They never knew what was happening. I mean, you can see why a guy would not want to be the head of a group that doesn't have a plan and is stepping into stuff that's highly controversial and dangerous, and every week and every day can bring a new dramatic development that they don't know what to do about, So this is what's happening. It's during this time that he comes, apparently within a few months, to the place where he's saying, I believe all the stuff I have learned. And I believe, the fact is, after he, grew up and started making speeches, almost every speech he made in church or out, he quoted Jesus, or he quoted the Gospels, or he quoted the prophets. So he was really into this, and he's thinking about all this. I really believe in these things. I really believe in loving your enemy. His daddy had really emphasized that for his whole life. You love your enemy. You treat them as courteously as you can. And so King believes all this, but see what had happened was, remember, this is the beginning. This is when he's just first starting to get some prominence, which he didn't particularly intend. And he comes home late after a meeting, and he goes to bed, and after midnight sometime, the phone rings, and so he answers it. And there's this snarly, ugly voice calling him names and telling him that he needs to be out of town within a month or his house will be bombed and he and his kids will all be shot. And, we've all heard these stories, but I mean, this is really happening. And this is at the beginning of his prominence. He's not a nationwide household name yet, He's just trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do? So he got up and he went to the kitchen and he put on a pot to boil for coffee. He stood there and watched it, thinking, I just really can't do this. This is asking too much, What if something happens to my kids or to my wife? He said, I didn't get into that. I didn't get into this for that. And yet, he was trying to figure out, how do I step back without everybody else collapsing too? Everybody else giving up. And so the coffee's ready, and he makes him coffee, and he sits at, this is according, of course, to him telling the story later. He sits down at the table, and he's got his head in his hands, and his eyes are full of tears, and he's saying, I can't do it, Lord. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to keep going. And he said, apparently, for the first time in his life, he actually felt the presence of God in the room, And he heard a message. Martin King, I want you to stand for what's true, and I want you to stand for what's right. And then there's that line from the end of the Great Commission, and lo, I am with you always. I mean, he's a Baptist preacher's kid growing up in the 40s and the 50s. He speaks King James English. And lo, I am with you always. And it comforted him. He still didn't have an answer, but except his answer was, keep going. Don't step out of this. Well, all kinds of things happened. His house was firebombed. Nobody was hurt. It was only a little over 10 years later that he was murdered. And he kind of expected it. But in the meantime, by his very, very determined commitment to loving your neighbor and to not being violent against your neighbor, even though he may be a complete jerk and a dangerous person, he committed himself to that. Not everybody around him did, but he did. I called this Make a Contribution. I didn't tell you that story yet, did I? I've told it about 4 times in the last 2 days. In 1964, so he's born in 1929. It's in the 50s that the Montgomery thing happens. So in 64, he's probably 33 or 35. And he had been super stressed out. So a doctor told him, you go to the hospital. Nowadays, you don't go to hospital to rest, Have you ever tried that? It don't work. But back then, you could go to the hospital to rest. So he gets a phone call from his wife, and she says, how does it feel to be the Nobel Peace Prize winner? And he thought, I don't know. I've never been one. But it turns out they had announced it, that he was. So the family, and friends all go to Oslo, I think it is, and there's a reception. And his dad, they called him Daddy King, is making a little speech. And he gets all teared up, and everybody in the whole room is crying, And he's saying, my wife and I are down there in Atlanta. The idea, I know where the story is. I know what book the story is in, but I couldn't find it. So I can't quote him. But the idea was, we're nobodies, and we're in Nowheresville, But Lord, me and my wife, is what he said, my wife and I came and we told God, Lord, we just want to make a contribution. We just want to make a contribution. And then he broke down, and then he says, and now Martin King Jr. is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, which doesn't tell you much. But the fact is, he became the Peace Prize winner because he promoted across the world just by his influence in this country, the idea of resisting oppression and mistreatment without smacking the other guy down. And they were winning. They didn't always win. They didn't win in Albany. He didn't have a whole lot of success in Chicago. But a lot of very significant things did change. So that's why I have here, make a contribution. King himself, I mean, I'm sure he said it, but I'm quoting that from his dad, who said he didn't have an agenda. They were pastor and pastor's wife. They were having kids, or they were going to have kids, and they just said, Lord, we just want to make a contribution. You know, we want to do some good in this world. We want to be worth the space and the air and the water we take up. And they felt like they had made a contribution. I want to read you 2 or 3 quotes from King. Now, King was, you know, a PhD stands for Doctor of Philosophy. And we use it applied to a whole lot of different areas of study. But there are weirdos in this world who actually get PhDs in philosophy. Now, those are odd people. King was unusually stable and sensible for being a PhD in philosophy because he studied it in order to understand what was going on in the world around him, what God was doing, and how to cooperate with that. But listen to what he says. Evil is not merely a principle. Evil is stark, grim, and colossally real. Evil is recalcitrant and determined, and never voluntarily relinquishes its hold. Excuse me. All of us, some perhaps more than others, all of us have faced evil in our own lives. All of us have been under attack by evil, sometimes coming from within, sometimes coming from without. We probably have some sense that there's some truth to this. And he's just saying, it's not just by smiling and hoping that evil goes away. I've only got about 3 quotes here, folks. I mean, I've got dozens, but if you've never read Martin King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote in 1963 from a jail in Birmingham, it's good. It's a good summary of his thinking in a whole lot of areas. I'll quote from it in a minute. But here he is talking about love. This is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all mankind. Now you know, and he himself had opponents within the civil rights movement who thought he was way too nice, that all this talk about love was just silly, that it doesn't work. And some of them wanted to be violent, some of them wanted to stop short of violence, but be much more aggressive. So he says this idea of love, this is often misunderstood. It's often misinterpreted. It's readily dismissed by the niches of the world as a weak and cowardly force. But it has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of the human race. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am not speaking of that force which is just emotional bosh. I don't know what bosh is, but I expect it's something that sounds like the word. They're just emotional bosh. I am speaking of that force which all the great religions have seen. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door. Then he quotes John from 1 John. Let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. If we will love one another, God dwelleth in us, and his love is perfected in us. King James English he's quoting, you know. That's an extraordinary statement. John made it. King believed it. I think I have one more. There's nothing new about civil disobedience. It was seen sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar. Do you remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Did they disobey the king? And what happened to them? They got thrown in the furnace. And before they got thrown in, you know what they said? One of the coolest statements in the Bible. They said, "Our God, O King, is able to deliver us from your furnace. But even if he doesn't," whoa, you going to say that? "But even if he doesn't, we will not bow down." So the king is obviously appealing to a legitimate prior example here. Refused to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar because a higher moral law was involved. This disobedience was practiced by early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions. I am meeting young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust. Preacher's kid and a preacher saying that. Then he says, one of the coolest short lines from him, "Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber." Huh. We kind of don't do that. We kind of do that. But there's a lot of robbers running free, flying over us in their private jets. Well, a lot of people are sitting in prison for offenses that amount to $50 or something. Anyway, it's tomorrow's Martin Luther King Day. I want to read some scriptures that fit the kinds of things that he quoted often that are in the Bible, you know. So let's just look at these, shall we? Martin King Sr. saying, "We want to make a contribution." God answered their prayer. Matthew 25. The king. Now, Jesus is talking about himself, and it's obvious when you read the chapter that he's talking about himself. So in effect, we could read it. When I come, all these people are going to be, all these nations are going to be gathered before me, and I'm going to say to them some stuff. They're going to respond, and so he's summarizing this event. The king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world." Why? Now Jesus said this. Not only did he say it, he repeated it. And not only did he repeat it, but after he says this, he gives the reason, then they respond and they say it all over again, and they say, "When did we do that?" And he tells them. Then it all goes all over, and he says this all over again to the people who did not do it. And they repeat, "When did we not do it?" And they repeat it all. So this list of stuff is repeated 4 times in Matthew 25. As if maybe Jesus means it. You know? There's not a whole lot of things he repeats 4 times in a few minutes. 4, I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Now you know that nobody and no nation can feed everybody who's hungry, can give something to drink to everybody who's thirsty. You cannot welcome every stranger you run into and take him home with you. Please don't, you know? But Jesus wants to know, how do we react? And Jesus says in another place, when you're going to throw a banquet, go invite people you don't know. If you invite people you do know, they'll just invite you back. And then that's just a circle. But go invite people you don't know and people who can't pay you back. Crazy. Anyway, he says this, I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. This list of people is precisely the list of people that are kind of difficult to deal with sometimes. Have you noticed that? I mean, even if it's in Jesus or his cousin John who's in prison, the very fact that they're in prison implies there's a problem of some kind going on. And we kind of want to stay away from problems. So this whole thing. And then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? Or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in? Or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for... Now look at this little word. Remember I said, you can't take care of every stranger. You can't welcome every stranger. You can't feed every hungry person. But whenever you do it for one. Well, that doesn't seem like very big contribution to make. But Jesus said, when you do it for one, you did it for me. Hebrews. This is, who knows, 10, 20, 30 years later, somebody else writing about the gospel. Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. He's not promising you're going to meet angels this way. He's just saying, you never know who you're dealing with. And you might. Who knows? But the thing is, God is there. You're still doing it for Him. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison. That's a very high standard, folks. As if you were together with them. I don't like to think about that. Brad prayed earlier about people in hospital. I don't even like to think about that. I don't want to be laying there, hurting, wondering what's going to happen, not being able to do what I want to do, and not knowing who's going to do what to me, except they won't let me rest. I know that. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you were yourselves were suffering. It takes an extraordinary act of love and discipline to care about other people that much, to see their situation. I may not actually like them, I may not particularly enjoy their company, but to see their situation. So the Scripture, the things that King was trying to do are there in Scripture. We sang the song, He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what, are these still on? Every time I walk by, I get... He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. It's simple. I mean, it's simple to say. Now, Jesus had the wisdom to tell us, you do it to one, you're doing it to me. The fact is, we can't. We can't. I don't imagine anybody here can do what Martin King did. And he felt in some ways like a failure. We're probably not going to do the same things. Nobody else in that generation did the same things he did. They did a lot of other things. What are we supposed to do? Well, the Lord has told us. And what I like to take from King is he just really believed that Jesus meant it. He just really believed that. He just really believed that John meant it. The one who loves is born of God. Let's learn to love. He doesn't ever set the standard, neither King nor Jesus, that you got to solve the world's problems or Hastings' problems or your family's problems or even all of your own problems. But the one who loves is born of God. And that's a big deal, you know? That is a big deal. All of us could make a little list, a little description of the kind of people we'd like to hang out with for the rest of our lives. They wouldn't cross us, you know. They want to do the things we want to do. They want to do them when we want to do them. And if we don't feel like hanging out, well, they don't feel like hanging out either. Just, you know, somebody that meshes with us. But Jesus comes along. And then King follows him along and says, I'm sorry. You got to go out there where those real people are, and you got to love those real people. Those real people, they are something. They're also different. Really. Just figure out one of them, and then you got to go to the next. What a blessing. That's what the Lord is doing. The Lord is tickled about it. So from King, I get that serious conviction that what Jesus and the prophets are asking is really what God is asking. And it's really the way to live and to go. Then I find courage to keep going when you're not approved of, when you get a lot of resistance. And I find integrity to keep living according to what you really believe. So there's a number of things there. I imagine if I had had to work closely with him, he'd have irritated me sometimes, and vice versa. But there's some really good things there. I don't have it up here, but it is in the bulletin. Did you get a bulletin? I've got 3 here. If somebody didn't get one and wants one. On the back. And I don't remember which speech this is from, but I'll read it to you if I can find my copy. You may have heard it. He got to talking sometime in the last year or two of his life. He got to talking about what they're going to say when he's gone, which is a good thing to think about for everybody. What are they going to say for you? What if you die 6 months from now? What are they going to say about you? So he's saying, I would like somebody to mention, he's really one of the great speakers of American history. I'm not even going to pretend, all right? I'm just going to read it because he's also have profound words and profound ideas. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. Whether we disagree with points of his strategy, you can't disagree with that. That is admirable. That is something to look at. Tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. And I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. All the other shallow things. Wow. Well, folks, through the course of the year we have a bunch of holidays. I try in general to say something about the particular holiday that's going by. Coming up, we got President's Day. We got St. Patrick's Day. We should talk about him. What a guy. We got all kinds of stuff coming up. Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, amazing people. But it's King Day. A guy worth thinking about, a guy worth remembering, a guy who truly gave his whole heart to what he believed God wanted done in his time and his place. And that's what we need to learn. We got a good song, and it's a prayer. So as we sing it and enjoy it, the prayer is, Lord, make me a blessing. Will you stand with me?